If you're planning on aging or maturating your spirits, there's something that you're absolutely going to have to do. Get wood. Would you like some help with that? How's it going, chasers? I hope you're having a kick-ass week. I'm Jesse. This is Still It, and today, let me put this down. We are talking about maturation, about how to prepare oak so you can age, maturate your spirits. And there is something, if you haven't done this, there's something absolutely magical about it. It's one of those things that adds up to way more than the sum of its parts. It's going to significantly change the spirit, add a whole bunch of complexity, mellow it out. In short, it's going to make it delicious. And this stuff, wood, more specifically, more often, oak is going to be the catalyst for that. But how do we find it? How do we get it ready? How do we use it? For the purposes of this video, I'm going to focus specifically on American white oak for two reasons. One is that it's depending on where you are, generally a whole lot easier to get hold of. And two, it is by far the most popular oak used to maturate spirits. But, of course, I do need to at least address the fact that there is a whole wide range of different woods that you can use. There is, of course, French oak. I've just been sent some Gariana oak from Oregon by Christopher at Badmo Legacy Barrels. You can use all sorts of different fruit woods, some nut woods. The list goes on. Here in New Zealand, I've played around with Manuka and Pahudakawa. First things first, if you're going to play with something different, all power to you. You might end up with something that's delicious and different. You might end up with something that's similar to oak. You might end up with something that's terrible and disgusting, but at least you explored that route. The number one thing is just to make sure that the wood itself isn't poisonous. Okay? I think we can agree on that. Let's move on and talk mostly about American white oak from here on in. The first thing you're going to need to do is get hold of the stuff. Now, if you have the means and the ability, you can, of course, cut some down yourself. That's a possibility. You can also beg, borrow, and steal from furniture shops. This is where this came from. Importers, wood purveyors, anything like that. If you can get hold of American white oak, you can potentially use it. Please, please, please make sure that it hasn't been treated, especially if it's being exported and imported. They have a tendency to, in New Zealand especially, blast the entire container with some nasty ass pesticides and so on and so forth. So you don't want that going into your spirits. The next option, which often turns out to be the easiest for people, is to get hold of an old barrel and tear it down. This is a stave. It's actually off a French oak barrel that's been toasted and not charred. The advantage to getting hold of a barrel is that you know that the wood has been prepared specifically for maturation already. Most of your hard work has been done for you. We'll get into that in just a second. The downside is that often barrels, depending on where they came from, what they were used for, and so on and so forth, have had barrel preserver added into them. And that's actually what this sort of scummy, scaly stuff is on the side of the stave. Once again, you do not want this stuff in your spirits. It's not good for you. So make sure that you scrub, brush any barrel staves down just in case, especially if you're seeing any of the scaly stuff. The preserver goes in as a solution, but if it dries out, it'll go like this. A whole barrel for a hobbyist is a buttload of wood. I've given some of this away. I've used a bunch of it. I've had it for probably 2 years now, and I haven't used anywhere near half of the barrel. Depending on where you are, you will find different barrels more easily attainable in different ways. So here in New Zealand, getting ex-bourbon barrels is expensive as hell because they all come from America, funnily enough. But what we do have is a thriving wine industry. So getting ex-wine barrels is a whole lot cheaper and a whole lot easier for us in New Zealand. Think about what your area, what your region is known for, what it makes, and try and approach those people. You can, of course, go down to the big box store or the hardware store, go to where all the barbecue stuff is hanging out, and you'll often find chunks of ex-bourbon barrel sold for smoking purposes. And of course, there's also the option of just buying some oak that's ready to go. This is our product, Chase the Craft Maturation Sticks. This is supplied by, well, it was by Ben at Badmo, now by Christopher at Badmo Legacy Barrels. And this, I'll talk about, well, you'll realize why this is a little bit more special as we go on through this video. But there's other products out there as well. Have a hunt around and see what's available for you. Obviously, whatever suits you best. Some people enjoy going through the whole process. Some people want to save a buck going through the whole process. I completely get it. If you want to get these, they're available at chasethecraft.com. Oh, and while you're there, check out the new coin as well, if you haven't seen it already. So, now you have some oak, the first step is to figure out whether or not it has been seasoned suitably for our purposes. So let's start way back at the beginning. If you are cutting your own oak, no, it hasn't been seasoned suitably at all. And I would put anything that you've got from a furniture shop, offcuts from a builder, anything like that, if it wasn't specifically selected and processed for the intent of maturating spirits, it's almost certainly, well, it's likely that it's been kiln dried, in which case, in my mind, no, it's not really suitable for spirits yet. In other words, if you have wood that has been cut yourself, or you got it from a furniture store, you're going to need to season it yourself as well. How do we do that? Good news is it's not tricky at all. The bad news is that you're going to have some patience because it's going to take a while. The first step is to cut it down into pieces that are manageable and are at least somewhat larger than what you're going to use in the end. Honestly, at this stage, it's mostly about logistics, although I would imagine that the smaller the pieces of oak or wood, the faster it will season. But this is probably a little bit, if I was doing this again, this is probably a little bit on the small side for what I would cut it to. I would probably, if I had large pieces of wood to work with, I would probably cut it down into sizes like this. And the reason for that is that we're going to stack it outside in the elements, essentially like Jenga. The idea is that you want to have the elements, the weather, the water getting into it, and you want each piece of wood to get some contact with all of that. We want it to get wet. We want it to dry out. We want it to cycle through this process a whole bunch of times. If you're in an area that is just dry all the freaking time, you could spray it down with water, I don't know, like once a week maybe. But the idea is essentially we're drying out and kind of leaching out some of the more intense flavors, but we're also breaking the wood down just a little bit in the process of just sitting in the sun, sitting in the wet, but also the little things that are going to grow on this. Eventually this is going to go from looking like this to looking like this. How long do you need to let this process go for? Absolute bare minimum, I would say 6 months. Ideally, if you can, longer. So in my mind, it would be a good idea to get a large stack of wood that's going to last you for years, stick it out in the yard, let it start aging, use it as you need it, and if it gets to the point where it's 2, 3, 4 years old, bring it all inside and process it. For context, this was out in the weather for 18 months. This one hasn't gone too gnarly. I don't see anything literally growing on it. There's no mold or moss or anything like that, but it does happen. And at this stage, it's probably advisable to kind of clean it up, sand it, use a planer, a thicknesser, whatever you have available to you. I'll be honest, sometimes I don't do that. I'm going to burn it with fire anyway later on. Your call. But the next step, regardless of what you're dealing with, is to start breaking this down into the size that you actually want to use it in. And funnily enough, I think this is about the perfect size, which is why we made them this size. There is something to be said potentially for wanting more of the long grain exposure to the spirits rather than the cutting across the grain. So all that means is when you're breaking these down, cut them or split them so that the grain is traveling along the length of the kind of domino shape that you're creating. So all 3 versions of the blocks we have now are essentially the same. They've been seasoned. This one for 4 years, yard aged in Kentucky. This one probably kiln dried and then about 1.5 years in my backyard. And this, whatever the hell they did to this barrel beforehand, I have no idea. And they've all been cut down into relatively the right size, although I didn't do a great job of eyeballing Did I? Anywho, now we have the job of toasting. Ooh, earthquake. Interesting. It's over. Now we have the job of charring and or toasting these bad boys to get the flavors we desire in our spirit. And we've got a little bit of good news, bad news for you here. The good news is that we've teamed up with the people over at Into the AM again to make this insanely cool shirt for the community. I think it's absolutely rad. The bad news is that you can't actually get it yet. It will be released in 1 week from today, and I'll be back again in a week to tell you that it's out, give you the code for a discount, and so on and so forth. But in the meantime, you can check out some of their new stuff, like these new retro shirts. Retro in design, retro also in the fact that they feel like old school, high quality shirts. They're 100% cotton. I'm kind of partial to the polyester blend. I like them, but there is something reassuring and nostalgic about 100% cotton shirts still. You can, of course, still get the two other Chase the Craft Into the AM collaboration shirts, the one with the astronauts in them. Those are both dope and they're still available at the moment. There's a link in the description down below. If you use that link and buy whatever you feel like getting from Into the AM, you'll get a 10% discount. Back to toasting and charring. I like to think about this in terms of cooking meat, more specifically steak. So you've got three things that go along with that, right? You have the internal doneness on the inside. Do you want it medium rare? Do you want it well done? Do you want it blue? Then you have the crust on the outside. How crispy and crunchy do you want it on the outside? And the third thing is the gradient between the two. Do you want it pink all the way to the edge and then a big crust, or do you want some gray meat in between? And like steak, there's no right way or wrong way to do this, although some people will tell you differently. It really comes down to personal preference and exactly what you want to create in the final spirit. So let's have a look at this graph that's been floating around for ages in Facebook groups and distilleries and forums. And in my experience, for the most part, as long as you're dealing with American white oak that has been seasoned well, it's actually pretty freaking accurate. I would like to say there's one sort of factor that this graph doesn't take into account at all, and that is straight up char. Wood that's been burnt literally to a crisp. There's no real wood left anymore. It's basically charcoal. That doesn't take into account, the graph doesn't take that into account, and essentially the charcoal isn't going to add a whole lot of flavor, maybe a touch of smokiness, but what it is going to affect is kind of the filtering of the spirit, and also the color of the spirit. Now for me, there is an exception to this rule, and we'll talk about that in a second, but for the most part, if you're maturating spirits on wood, you're going to want at least some char. The exception to that rule is, of course, if you're not looking for a heavy color contribution, or if you're not looking to filter the spirit at all, you're just really looking to add the flavor of the wood into the spirit. So we'll set that aside for the moment, because to me that makes more sense with something like French oak, and we'll focus on the American white oak and more traditional, everything that comes from American white oak, so bourbon and single malt predominantly. I'm going to toast and char 3 different batches of oak, 3 different ways, because I think it shows you the full sort of spectrum of what is possible here, and it'll allow you to dial in exactly what you want to do for the flavor profile you want. So what I'm going to do is use some raw, untoasted, but well-seasoned oak, and I'm just going to toast this one. Now, this is kind of like pan-searing a steak. Because I want a gradient from a really thick crust on the outside of this thick steak through to raw, completely blue in the middle, I am going to cook it hot, but I'm going to take my time with it. I'm not going to char it too heavily in any one spot at any one time, because I want some of that heat to sink through into the wood and create a gradient of all the different flavors on that graph as we get closer to the center. All right, so that took me a solid 10 minutes to slowly work through it. Hot. Obviously a whole lot more economical if you do 4 or 5 at the same time. I'm not going to cool that down right now because I want more of that heat to sort of slowly seep into the wood. And while that's doing that, oh, by the way, guys, quick note, don't do this on any random brick. I'm using this one because it's a fire brick and it's not going to shatter on me. All right, now we can deal with some toasting. So I'm going to do 2 different toasts, one at 140 degrees Celsius, which is, sorry guys, I can't remember this in Fahrenheit, and one at, let's say 210. And I'll explain why I'm doing it at those 2 temperatures in a little bit. But I do this just in the internal oven, in the kitchen. I like to wrap it in a little bit of tin foil, mostly because I want to protect the wood from our filthy oven. Some people say that this stinks the house out. I love the smell. My wife loves the smell. I'm not worried about it. Just be aware that maybe some of your, someone else in the house won't appreciate it. Pick your timing well. But I just do a single layer of tin foil. I space the staves out a little bit so the heat can get all around them, and just give them a gentle wrapping. You can, of course, toast them for any time you like. I've settled on about an hour and a half is pretty good for me. They go into the oven for an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours at the temperature you desire. I'll see you when these come back out again. Whew. Yep, those are a little warm. I need to write on these right now so I don't forget which one is which. Groovy. All right, so now we have this wood, for the most part, toasted to the same temperature all the way into the middle. And I should mention too, guys, whenever you're toasting or cooking wood, it is the same as meat. You can always cook it more and it will gain the characteristics of wood or meat that's cooked more. What you can't do is go backwards. So if you cook these at 210 for 4 hours in the oven, all of the wood is going to behave like it was cooked at 410. Does that make sense? Seems obvious, but it took me a while to get my head around that. Okay, so what we've done here, this one's cooled down now, and that is like the pan-seared version of a steak, right? It's super crusty on the outside, there's a bit of a gradient. Imagine it's a real big thick steak, and on the inside it's completely blue. This is more like sous videing. So we've cooked it to our internal doneness all the way through. This one I would say is kind of like medium at 210 for 2 hours. And this one is kind of like medium rare, I would say. 140, I did this one for an hour and a half. Now it's time to put the crust on them. So the difference here is that instead of doing this really slow, I want to do it hard and fast. We've already got the internal doneness to what we want it to be. What I don't want to do now is then cook this really slow over a barely hot barbecue and waste all of the effort that we've put into cooking the inside of these to the doneness we want. Let's torch the 210 version first. These I want to be a vanilla bomb. I want a whole bunch of vanilla out of these, but I do want the charcoal on the outside. I'm going to cook these as hard and fast as I can for a very short amount of time, so we have some of that charcoal property on the outside. Mostly we just have vanilla bomb oat on the inside. And when I'm cooking them like this, I don't want the carryover heat going in and messing up that lovely toast that we've already done. So I get them into water ASAP to get them cooled down. All right, I'm going to put these back here now on the paper that tells me what doneness they are, so I don't forget. You'll notice too that I haven't charred the ends. I don't dislike the idea of having some of that exposed to the spirit relatively quickly for maturation, because, like we said, it's already toasted to that vanilla bomb kind of temperature. All right, now let's do the one that was at 140. This is kind of This temperature to me is kind of like a sweet, but still a bit oaky flavor. And on this one, what I'm actually going to do is kind of do 4 different chars. So on the first side, I'm going to char it enough that it is charred, and then I'm going to flip it, char it a little bit more, char it a little bit more. So we have, I like to think that it's kind of crowbarring a little bit of complexity into the spirit. You're getting a little bit more of everything without the spirit having to seep all the way into the stave. I'll show you what that looks like when we're done. So now we've ended up with 3 quite distinctive, different ways to impart flavor into our product. This one is like maybe a 2 or 3 level char. It's not that charred on the outside, but it's pretty much raw in the middle, and it has a pretty heavy gradient between the char and the raw on the inside. We have one that is toasted heavily on the inside with kind of a medium char on the outside and very little gradient in between. And we have another one that has been toasted much more lightly on the middle with 4 different chars on the outside without a whole lot of gradient in between as well. In a nutshell, if you want all of the inside of the wood to give the same flavor off, toast it at the temperature that matches up on this chart with the flavor that you want. Put it in the oven for an hour, 3 hours. If you're going to be making anything that's at all traditional for American or Scottish sort of style spirits, you're going to want to put a char on it, char it to the desired level you want. If you want more of a gradient going into the wood, do it slower and cooler. If you want very little gradient, do it hotter and faster. And now we're at the point where we can figure out how to use these things in spirits. The general idea here is that you're going to put the spirit into a vessel and the wood in there with it. Guys, stainless steel or glass, please, when it's sitting in there for long periods of time, I don't think this is something that's worth arguing about. Just use stainless or glass. I like to use these swing top jars because I can get them dirt cheap here in New Zealand. It's the cheapest option I've got. They come with these slightly sketchy silicon gaskets. I don't entirely trust these, once again, for long periods of time with high ABV product. So I wrap them in Teflon tape. And the advantage to that is that it also makes these jars not entirely airtight. You're not going to get giant angel shears, but you are going to get some kind of gas exchange between the two, getting a little bit of oxygen in here. It's not going to be micro-oxidation through the wood, but I think it's beneficial nonetheless. Now we need to talk volumes of spirit to size of wood versus the amount of time you're going to age it for. I've got very little wood in this. In fact, there's 2 pieces, and they add up to about half of one of these. This is a 3-liter jar. I've done that because I plan on aging this for probably 3 or 4 years. I want it to be in here for a long-ass time. If I was wanting to have this ready in a year and a half, I would use a whole one of these to 2-3 liters worth of spirits. If I really wanted to push it and have it ready in 6 months, I'd still only use a whole one of these, but I would split it into 2, maybe 3 pieces before I did the charring and get that in there just to give it a little bit more surface area. You can, of course, do more wood, more surface area for shorter amounts of time. But honestly, guys, I would say at a bare minimum, go to 3 months, and I probably wouldn't use any more wood than I just suggested. One of these to about 3 liters of wood split into 2 or 3 pieces. If you are doing that and you're pushing the amount of oak surface area to spirit, you're going to want to taste it fairly regularly. The more you push it, the more you're going to want to taste it because it can get away on you a whole lot. I would urge you guys, though, to at least aim for 6 months because there's just magical things that happen with time that don't happen with oak exposure. If it's getting a little bit extremely oaky and you have not yet reached the age that you want it to get to, pull a piece of oak out or pull, if you've got a whole one of these in there, pull this out, split it down the middle and put the half back in. And of course, remember guys, just because this has been used in some spirit, it's not used up. If anything, it's probably more desirable at that point in time because now you've got second use oak that is much harder to get hold of. And you can use it for something more like a sort of traditional Scottish style single malt. The flavor profile will change a lot. You'll get a little bit more of the sweetness and the kind of maturation aging process with less of the barrel spice and intense candy-like sweetness. It'll change over to more like glazed pastry. So don't throw them away once you've used them. Keep on using them. So I think that sums up the entire process of beginning to end for wood. If you have questions, please ask them in the comments down below, because there's a bunch of people that watch these videos that have been doing it longer than me, and they'll have some advice for you as well. If you found this video helpful, and I really and truly hope you have, please guys, give it a thumbs up, drop a comment in the comment section, do all the YouTubey things to make YouTube think this is awesome, and I'll catch you next time. Keep on chasing the craft. See ya.